Hey guys, what's up? So, unless you've been living under a rock for the past 20 or so years, you've likely heard of the franchise Yu-Gi-Oh! It probably doesn't really need an introduction, but for the uninitiated, because, well, there's probably some of you out there, it was a manga from the mid 90s to early 2000s. It has a well known anime adaptation and a lesser known anime adaptation, various anime spin offs, some of which are real bad, and also a very little known card game. Now, this video, as you can tell from the title, has nothing really to do with the commercial aspect of Yu-Gi-Oh! Or the card game or anything. Instead, we'll focus on the much less discussed, but fantastically written, usually, manga. Not just any part of the manga, though, but the very beginning, the good old school arc. So, the first three tankobon of the series, and the first chapter of Volume 4, make up what is commonly known as the school arc of Yu-Gi-Oh! This arc doesn't really appear in the Duel Monsters anime. I mean, it does briefly towards the end, but we'll get to that. So, in today's retrospective, my partner and I
Yellow.
are going to give an overview of the arc and then go a bit more in depth on our thoughts and feelings about the story and what we thought of the execution. Now, sit back and watch as two nerds, mostly me, but also two nerds, talk about a manga that isn't really about a children's card game, except for when it is. On a side note, I won't really be using their 4Kids names in these videos, as the manga mostly uses the Japanese names of the characters, even in the official translation of the manga, the Viz translation. So, if for some reason we refer to the dub version of the characters, we will address them by their dub names. But that won't really happen in this video. But until then, just for those of you who don't know the Japanese names, here's a list of all of the Japanese names of the characters and their English names. I may or may not put this in the description as well. Alright, so in this part, we're going to be talking about the story of the arc, and that's really going to make up the bulk of the video, but we're going to, of course, be interjecting our own thoughts throughout. So, half the arc is mostly made up of more episodic adventures taking place over one or two chapters, though the middle arc is a lot more serialized, focusing on developing the actual plot of the series, and that's where it really starts to get interesting. That's not to say the other chapters don't contribute, though, since many of them are more about enforcing the themes of the series or even facilitating character development. I'm not going to go over every chapter, but there are a few storylines in the arc I really think are worth touching on, such as, the pilot chapter to start. So the story starts with Yugi having yet to finish the Millennium Puzzle and calling it his greatest treasure. He tells Anzu, his one and only friend since childhood, that the legends say that when the puzzle is solved, it'll grant the solver a single wish. His wish? For a true friend. Yeah, guess Anzu isn't a good friend, despite being his friend since childhood. Anyway, Yugi is soon bullied by none other than Jonochi and Honda. Jonochi tells Yugi that he's only trying to teach Yugi to be a man, and he's introducing the main character arc for Yugi throughout the manga. This character arc is to become more confident and become more independent. And, yeah, that's a way to introduce it, I guess, by bullying him for playing games. Anyway, Jonochi ends up making fun of and then stealing a piece of the Millennium Puzzle, which he then proceeds to throw into the river because Jonochi's kind of an asshole in the first chapter. So, anyway, not long after this, Yugi runs into the hall monitor, Ushio, who's beaten Jonochi and Honda and tells Yugi he now has to pay him for taking out his bullies. And then he leaves. But not before beating Yugi as well, after he states that Jonochi and Honda are his friends. This moment is the first instance of Yugi becoming a man, if you want to put it that way, as well as the first spark of real friendship between Jonochi and Yugi. After that, Jonochi goes to the river that he threw the puzzle piece into and jumps in and finds it somehow. I imagine that took a while, but he ends up returning it to Yugi, who is finally able to finish the Millennium Puzzle. This leads to the very first transformation into Dark Yugi. And yes, he does in fact live up to the name, Dark Yugi. So, after transforming, Dark Yugi confronts Ushio and challenges him to a shadow game. This shadow game consists of the two of them taking turns stabbing a stack of bills on their hand, and whoever can collect the most without stabbing themselves wins. It's a little fucked up. So things start off good for Yugi, but soon enough Ushio decides the easiest way to win is just to kill Yugi and tries to stab him. This doesn't work out for him though, as Yugi forces him into a penalty game that sees him put into an illusion where he thinks that he's like rolling around in this pile of money, but it turns out just to be garbage and leaves. That's fun. Anyway, the chapter ends up ending with Yugi and Jonouchi starting their friendship, and Jonouchi introducing a riddle that becomes kind of the basis for the whole story going forward. What can be shown but can't be seen? The answer to that being friendship. Yeah, that's kind of the whole point of the manga, and that's far from the last time this riddle's going to come up. That's also the basic setup for a lot of the chapters past this. Yugi and company get into trouble, which usually involves Yugi getting hit by one of the villains. Then Dark Yugi challenges the villain of the week to a shadow game. When the villain loses, they're given a penalty game, and that's it. That's basically how most of these early chapters go. There's one penalty game where a TV director is forced to see everything in a censored mosaic after trying to film Yugi getting beat and telling him he'll censor his face while on TV so no one will know it's him. Yeah, that's his penalty game. Or there's another guy who's so obsessed with getting other people to hear his horrible singing that he's forced to hear the beating of his own heart ringing through his head, probably for eternity, and that sounds awful. I feel doing this is a good way to introduce another common idea in the series, that playing tabletop games is a great way to get to know your opponent. As someone who played a decent amount of both the actual card game and Magic, I can say the best part is playing with another person rather than a computer. And I love that Takahashi feels that focusing on that aspect of gaming is really important in the story, which is why you don't really see video games throughout the manga or anime or anything. It's all card games and tabletop games. Now, there's a few multi-chapter storylines that start with a story involving Jonouchi joining a gang, then getting tortured before Yugi electrocutes the gang. Yeah, that happens. In this story, we also learn a bit about Jonouchi's personal life, such as the fact that his father's an alcoholic who spends far too much time drowning in booze to spend time with his son. He goes so far as to throw a beer bottle at his front door the moment the door opens because he thinks it's Jonouchi walking in for the first time in 2 days. And the Father of the Year award goes to that guy. I don't know his name. After this, there's Kaiba. Yes, Kaiba shows up in the first actual arc of the manga, before the manga is really about card games. Except for in these chapters it is. Because in the two chapters that he's introduced in, chapters 9 and 10, that's where we are first introduced to duel monsters. At the time, it was a parody of Magic the Gathering called Witches and Wizards. Now, there were a few things that were condensed into the first arc of the Duel Monsters anime, and they were all taken from these early chapters of the manga. The first arc of the anime is Duelist Kingdom, which doesn't occur until like 60 chapters into the manga. It's the fourth arc. Here, we actually see the beginning, the first half of the first episode of the Duel Monsters anime. And that is where, Kaiba shows up and he's like, hey, you, Sugoroku, I see you have a blue eyes white dragon. Let me have it. That is taken from these. The second half of that episode where he actually challenges Sugoroku to a card game and takes his blue eyes, that is taken from much later. Not much later, but the next arc. That's not from this arc, so they combine two different stories. So the two-part chapter is about Kaiba trying to steal the Blue Eyes White Dragon from Sugoroku and being forced into a shadow game by Dark Yugi so that he can win it back. This shadow game at first seems to traumatize Kaiba, but then it's quickly revealed that it seems to turn him on. Wow, Kaiba. Kind of edgy. Now, at this point, Kaiba may seem a little more intense to those only familiar with the anime, especially the dub. That's partly because the Duel Monsters anime starts on the fourth main arc of the series, which had already seen Kaiba begin to change. This change doesn't really begin here, though, and I don't want to go too much further in depth about the Kaiba character in this video, because the next arc is kind of all about him. To finish this part up real fast, Kaiba and Yugi have a bit of a back and forth, and Kaiba's eventually able to summon Sugoroku's blue eyes, though he cheats to do it, pulls it out of his pocket. And so because he cheated, and this is a shadow game where all the monsters are real, it ends up vanishing, also due to Blue Eyes' connection to Sugoroku and Sugoroku's connection to Yugi. It ends up vanishing off his side of the field into the graveyard, and Yugi is able to summon it to his side of the field, and he defeats Kaiba with the very monster that he was seeking. It's a little ironic, I guess. He then cards Kaiba, much like Pegasus does later, and forces him into a penalty game where he'll experience death multiple times before he's finally released, which is horrifying. He was originally introduced as just another villain of the week, Kaiba was. He wasn't supposed to show up again after this, but the card game aspect got popular, so he was brought back with the game. Plus, he's honestly an interesting character. So, the two-part chapter, I think, is meant to enforce the idea of honesty and honorability, both things that Kaiba doesn't really have at this point. This can be seen when Kaiba cheats in the duel by pulling Blue Eyes out of his pocket. This is what leads to his downfall, whereas the love Sugoroku and Yugi share, as well as the bond between Sugoroku and his Blue Eyes, allowed Yugi to succeed. I think this might be the moment he chose not to cheat in games going forward. Only that, though. He still is kind of an ass for quite some time. I think it's also important to note that Kaiba lacks his own Blue Eyes at this point in the series. His iconic 3 Blue Eyes are currently out of his possession and off somewhere else in the world. We'll get more on that later, though. Yeah, I'm just gonna leave off Kaiba here. The most important part of this arc, though, is the story featuring Shadi. Shadi's introduced to us in Chapter 13, and his story covers up to Chapter 20. This storyline involves Sugoroku being invited to an Egyptian exhibit featuring multiple artifacts found by an old friend of his named Professor Yoshimori. Though this is really a bit of a front for Yoshimori's digging partner Kanekura to steal and sell the Millennium Puzzle, which he does manage to get a hold of. Yugi kind of gives it to him after being told that it will be put on exhibit. He's a little naive early on. Anyway, he's confronted by Shadi, who uses the Millennium Scale to test Kanekura's spirit and intentions. Ultimately, it's decided that he's corrupt of heart, and the scale uses a mut to kill Kanekura.
Alright, now this is the point in the arc that I actually started getting interested in the manga. Now, the Millennium Scale is essentially the same scale that Anubis would use to weigh the hearts and souls. Anubis being one of my favorite Egyptian gods, so of course that got my interest. Shadi is weighing the heart of Kanekura, and it doesn't really work out for Kanekura, since he, kinda ends up dead.
And following that, he runs into Yugi, who's there to retrieve his puzzle. Here, Shadi decides to enter the Room of Yugi's Soul, which is part of the arc included in the Duel Monsters anime, right after Pegasus is defeated and all that. Here, Shadi realizes that Yugi is unique, in that he has 2 soul rooms. One for himself, which is filled with games and toys as a symbol of his innocence, and one for Dark Yugi, featuring an old decrepit door. Behind this door, Shadi finds Dark Yugi standing there waiting for him. It's here that we get our first biggest mention to one of the major plot threads of the series, Dark Yugi's origin. Shadi mentions that the inside of the room and the presence of Dark Yugi is akin to that of a pharaoh. Dark Yugi brings him into the maze of his soul, challenging Shadi to find the true room of his soul. Shadi encounters multiple booby traps as he looks, further cementing how this room, for, lack of a better word, is akin to tombs of ancient pharaohs. They're littered with booby traps, the final resting place that no one can get to. I also love this bit of foreshadowing. Even if outside of the storyline it doesn't really get built up too much for a while, I think this might be why it's placed where it is in the anime as well, right at the end of Duelist Kingdom, just before Battle City starts. Eventually, Shadi makes it to the room where Dark Yugi is sat waiting, only for Shadi to encounter a trap. A bottomless trap hole, pun intended, that causes Shadi to begin to fall before being caught by Dark Yugi himself. I find this interesting because the anime actually makes Dark Yugi darker in this scene, I think anyway. In the anime, normal Yugi catches Shadi before it's too late, and implies that Dark Yugi was just gonna let Shadi fall. Here, however, Dark Yugi stops him himself, and seems to have only let Shadi start to fall as a bit of a punishment for invading his soul. I think this is one of the only times this sort of thing happens, since typically the anime toned down how dark Yugi can be. Such as, he doesn't set anyone on fire in the anime. He does kill some people, but not many. Back to the plot. Shadi leaves Yugi's mind and returns the puzzle to Yugi, after taking it back when he killed Kanekura. Later, Shadi takes an opportunity to use the Millennium Key to control Anzu's mind. It's here that Shadi challenges Dark Yugi to a shadow game to test him and learn if he's really the Pharaoh. If he fails, Anzu will be killed.
This is the point where we get to see Dark Yugi on the back foot. At no point until this did Yugi even show even a slight hint of struggling or fear. But through these chapters, Dark Yugi is actually afraid.
So Anzu is hoisted up on the side of the roof, way above the ground, tied only to three uh, usha. This word. These three belong to Yugi. Each time his heart begins to waver, they begin to crack and will quickly break. If all three break, she'll fall. There is a fourth Ushabdi, or Ushabdi, that represents Shadi's heart, though this is tied to the Millennium Key. If this Ushabdi should break, the key will slide down the rope to Anzu's hand, freeing her from the key's control. This game takes place over 3 stages. First, he forces Yugi into an illusion where grotesque bodies emerge from the ground and start grabbing at him and pulling themselves up onto him. The only way to make them stop is for Yugi to solve a riddle. What creeps on the ground and clings to the pillars? Yugi quickly figures out the solution to this puzzle, with the answer being his shadow. The next stage involves Amut coming out of the ground and grappling Yugi. He's forced into a game of concentration. I'm pretty sure it's called memory, but I suppose that could just be a regional thing. Anyway, instead of matching the slabs on the ground, he has to figure out what the middle tile is, which is the only tile that doesn't have a match. Yugi's only hint is that the squares are the mirror of Amut. Yugi has 5 minutes to figure out the puzzle, and it certainly takes him every second. Seriously, there's like 1 second left when he finishes. He soon realizes that the answer is the beast's mouth, since everything else he has 2 of. So Yugi still has all 3 of his Ushabti, though one has become severely cracked over the course of the last 2 rounds. The final round, however, is a whole other beast. Shadi summons an illusion of Jonouchi for a game where he and Yugi will have to take turns throwing the Millennium Puzzle. The point being that whichever direction the puzzle points, the opponent must walk 2 tiles in that direction until they fall to their deaths. Yugi quickly loses 2 of his Ushabti after the illusion of Jonouchi, made from the tainted memories of when he was still a bully to little Yugi, starts treating Yugi like he did back in those days. Dark Yugi, however, opts not to partake in the game, telling Shadi that his trust in his friend will prevail. Shadi behelms this, and tells him that the point of this is to show Yugi that friendship is a poison that will hold him back. This is quickly proven wrong, though, when the illusion of Jonouchi lives up to what Yugi said and vanishes with an accepting smile on his face. In his disbelief at what just happened, Shadi's Ushabti is shattered and Anzu is returned to normal. After this, Shadi accepts his defeat and leaves, but not before telling Yugi that his bloodline has been waiting for someone like him, and that he should be able to open the door. Around this time, Jonouchi and Anzu start to notice a difference between Yugi and Dark Yugi, though Yugi still doesn't quite realize the changes. This was briefly brought up to him by Shadi earlier in the story, but Yugi has yet to consciously notice the change, just noticing that he occasionally blacks out, though he keeps that detail from his friends. I personally love this part of the story. I know a lot of people don't like the whole power of friendship thing, which I get if it's not really the point, because it can make things feel contrived and kind of like a cop-out, and I agree. Though, I think it works in stories like this, where the friendships between the characters are the driving force behind the themes of the story, and even make up the main theme. After all, Takahashi named Yugi and Jonouchi using the word yujo, which means friendship in Japanese. It's also just really interesting to see Dark Yugi have to struggle in this story, because until this point, that hadn't really happened. He's always just the best, and here we see him actually scared. A genuine look of fear crosses his face more than once in these chapters against Shadi, and it's really quite refreshing. After this story, we have a couple more episodic chapters which continue to build on the themes of the manga so far, and even mirror some of the early chapters. One of my personal favorites being the Hanasaki and Zombire 2-part chapter of chapters 21 and 22. Now the last 2 chapters begin to build up the next arc, which are chapters 24 and 25. First, we're introduced to a game called Capsule Monsters, which is basically a gacha chess game. Luckily, we can just ignore the 4Kids anime named after that game, because it has little to do with it. It just has the name. Here in this chapter, we're introduced to the best Kapumon player, Mokuba Kaiba. Now, with knife included, Mokuba challenges Yugi to a game for defeating his brother and driving him crazy. Yugi accepts. Not that he really has much of a choice. Seriously, they held him at Uzi point. Where did a child get a fucking Uzi? Yugi even points it out in the story. It's mind-boggling, but it's Kaiba. The Kaibas, I bet, can get anything, so whatever. They're insane. Anyway, the game starts and is clearly rigged, because why wouldn't it be when a Kaiba's involved at this point? Mokuba has an advantage by far, yet still loses. Yugi manages to pull him into a trap and hits him with a move that manages to take out all of Mokuba's pieces in one fell swoop. Mokuba claims that Yugi may have won now, but he will be defeated by what Kaiba is working on. Something called Death Tea. After this, Mokuba is subjected to a penalty game where he's locked inside one of the capsules that the capsule monsters come in, which is intense and horrifying, and the look on his face is I wouldn't want to be him. That's a lot for a kid to go through. Like I said, Dark Yugi's fucked up. So then, in the final chapter of this arc, Yugi and Jonouchi are hanging out at an arcade, where they see that someone named Kai is at the top of all the leaderboards. Naturally, they learn that it's Kaiba, and learn that he's making the ultimate game. After hearing this, Yugi decides to just play a fighting game featuring a character that's basically based on Bruce Lee. Yugi is challenged by another player who plays as the same Bruce Lee character, but Yugi just stomps him. So obviously, the guy challenges Yugi again, only to lose again, and again, and again, and again. Yeah, this goes on for a while. So long, in fact, that Jonouchi gets bored and goes to get some soda. I think it went on for like 30 matches or something. That's insane. At this point, the guy who he honestly looks just like Bruce Lee finds Yugi and knocks him out for continually beating him. Glad to know that people all over the world are like that. Neat. Anyway, after knocking out Yugi, he steals the Millennium Puzzle and leaves. Yugi wakes up as Jonouchi finds him, and after hearing about what happened, Jonouchi chases after the guy and confronts him. They agree to fight, but with knives clenched between their teeth, pointing towards the back of their throat. Though Jonouchi tells the Bruce Lee wannabe that he doesn't need it. Only Jonouchi will have the knife. They begin to fight, but Jonouchi manages to win by breaking the guy's jaw with one punch! Saitama, look out. After beating him, Jonouchi takes back the puzzle and returns it to Yugi. And with that, the arc is over. So, for my final thoughts, something I think is really cool about the final chapter is that it mirrors the first chapter in a sense. Specifically, the first chapter involved Yugi coming to the protection of Jonouchi, this being what sparked their friendship. And then the arc ends with Jonouchi doing the same for Yugi. I love how Takahashi builds on those themes of friendship and independence through these early chapters. Something I don't like as much is exactly how episodic it is. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy the story of the chapters, but a lot of it is rather formulaic. As I said, basically Yugi and friends do something, encounter the villain of the chapter, the villain does something to piss off Yugi, then Dark Yugi comes out to challenge the villain to a game. I really like the Shoddy story for that reason, because it's 8 chapters that begin to advance the plot beyond the more formulaic stories of the individual chapters.
Now, I didn't really like the episodic chapters that much. It didn't really hold my interest, but I absolutely adored the shoddy stuff. Not to say that I hated the episodic chapters. I think Takashi does an excellent job of creating villains of the week you can honestly hate, or even sometimes maybe even see yourself in. Like that guy in chapter 3 who forces Yugi and Hanasaki to listen to him sing. I'm actually quite a bit of a songbird myself, and I had to think, hey, am I this guy? Then again, though, I don't think I'd actually force people to come to my concerts.
Though that episodic format is fixed a bit for me around chapter 9 when they start doing more 2-part chapters. While we skipped over a lot of those episodic portions, there are definitely things worth reading in each of these chapters. I also really enjoy chapters 11 and 12, which feature Jonouchi joining the gang, and you get a bit of insight into his home life. Jonouchi is honestly one of my favorite characters, and that won't change going forward.
And same here. Jonichi is great and handled way better here than in the anime. Plus, seeing those hints of his home life being not exactly happy go lucky makes him far more relatable. I only wish we'd have gotten to see more of that in the anime.
I also think that the final 5 chapters are really fun. They all have a lot of charm, and while we largely skipped over it, chapters 22 and 23 are 2 of my favorite chapters of the arc. Hanasaki is a treasure, and I'm honestly a little sad that he doesn't feature after this point in the manga. I don't think he needed to be a protagonist or anything, but it would have been a lot of fun, I think anyway, to see him pop up now and again later in the series. All in all, I really like the arc, but it is very much an introductory arc for the series, and very shonen. in how it's more episodic. I hope you guys will join us next time, though, when we talk about the Death Tea arc.